Okay, so a couple more minutes, but we're just going to do some general housekeeping before we get started here. So hello, my name is Rachel. I work at ReForest London. I'm the neighborhood relief coordinator. So I run the programs that give away free trees here in London, Ontario. And we're planning some tree giveaways. We have about 1,200 trees to give away this fall. So if you're interested in getting some more trees, be sure to keep your eyes out on our newsletter, our social media, and our website for some more information about that. I just want to make sure, can everyone see the screen okay? Shaq, can you answer for me? Great. So some general notes about tonight, if everyone doesn't mind keeping your microphones off for the presentation, you can use the chat box on the right to ask any questions. And Shaq, who is my colleague helping me run this event tonight, will either answer them in the question box as we go, or we'll bring them back up for us at the end. And there will be a question period at the end where you can turn your microphones off and ask me any questions that you might have. Also, you might have noticed a little pop-up on the screen. This webinar is being recorded and we'll email it to you afterwards. Probably in the next week or so, you'll get a copy of the recording with some of the notes that I'm going to speak about tonight as well. So you'll be able to refer back to it for any of your tree care needs and questions. I also wanted to begin for any of you who are in London, Ontario, like I am here, with the land acknowledgement. I would like to begin by acknowledging the treaty territory of the Anishinaabe, which is defined within the pre-Confederation treaty known as the London Township Treaty of 1796. Throughout time, this region has also become the current home of the Haudenosaunee and the Lenni Lenape nations. So just going to talk to you a little bit about Westminster Pond Centre and Signal Boost Initiative. So that is the Signal Boost Initiative is a part of Westminster Pond Centre, which is affiliated and are part of ReForest London. We're all connected here together. This webinar is brought to you by Signal Boost tonight. And you can see here we have some sponsors: Canada Life, who's been a lead sponsor of ReForest London for 9 years, and Ontario Trillium Foundation, who made this webinar possible tonight. We have some other upcoming webinars and events with Signal Boost Initiative. We have a tree specialist training on Monday, October 23rd. For that, you have to have taken our ReForest London 101. A little bit of background: our tree specialists are part of ReForest London. They are a more specialized volunteer that comes out to our tree planting events and helps ensure that everything runs smoothly. They help run the events and teach other people how to plant trees properly. If that sounds like something you might be interested in the future, you can reach out to either signalboost@reforestlondon.ca or info@reforestlondon.ca for some more information. We did just have our precursor class to that, which is ReForest London 101. But if you're really interested in becoming a specialized volunteer, we have some recordings of ReForest London 101 that you may be able to watch and then still be able to sign up for that tree specialist training. It's really great. You learn how to plant trees properly, you learn all about tree ID. We do a hike involved with it. We'll do some soil sampling, and you'll just learn how to be a really great volunteer and all about trees. We also have a fruit and nut tree webinar coming up with Wildcraft Permaculture. So if you're interested in some more information about your fruit and nut trees and pruning, I'll talk a little bit about pruning tonight, but Jessica, who runs the fruit and nut tree webinar, is way more knowledgeable than I am, and she's great, does a great webinar on that. We also have eco hikes every Wednesday. So if you're interested in doing an eco hike, you can email signalboost@reforestlondon.ca or head to our website for some more information about these events. So tonight's workshop, I'm going to get right into it here. We're going to talk today about selecting the right tree, some tree care basics, how to plant a tree, how to spot a dying tree, some common pests and disease, and I'm going to briefly cover the London tree bylaw. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. I think that the information I have on my slides tonight might be a little incorrect about the London tree bylaw, to be honest. So I'll talk a little bit about it, but we'll send up a follow-up email after this with any more relevant information that might come up. All right, so just getting it all set up here. Perfect. So first things first, selecting the right tree. So with this webinar, some of you may already own trees, wondering about taking care of your current trees, some young trees, or thinking about planting trees. So I'm going to talk a little bit about selecting the right tree and how to plant a tree before we get into the tree care basics. These are just some really great steps to ensure that your tree survives and doesn't need as much care as a tree that wouldn't, that would need more help if it wasn't the right species or if it wasn't planted correctly. So I'll talk a little bit about that. It'll help you in the future and help you know if maybe something's going wrong with your tree because of those reasons. So selecting the right tree, there's a few things you want to consider. And the first of those is that you want to make sure you have a native tree or shrub. Native trees are really important as they support local habitat and our local region. If you get a non-native tree, they may become invasive or not actually have any other benefits other than just looking nice on your yard. And as nice as to have a tree that looks nice, you also want a tree that supports birds, pollinators, and other insects and animals. You can get free trees, as I mentioned before, from myself at ReForest London in the fall. If you're interested in free trees, like I said, keep your eyes out on our newsletter on our website. We're giving away some more this fall. And we do yearly giveaways. So in every spring and fall, we try to give away lots of trees to London locals. Tell your friends. If you wanted to buy a tree, I think I'll get into that later. So I'll tell you about where to buy them if that's what you're interested in. And then we'll talk about yard conditions and size of tree. So size of tree is very important. You want to make sure that you're mindful of your surroundings. Are you close to a structure such as your house? Is there underground infrastructure such as water lines and veins that you want to stay away from? And are you near power lines? If you're near the power lines, you're going to want to go with something shorter. If you're too close to your house, you want to go with something smaller or more straight up and down. So you just want to be really mindful of the size you're going with. And so if you get a free tree from us online, we have an order form that breaks down all the sizes of the trees, so you know you're going to get the right size. But it's good to do some research about the trees you're getting before you get them, so you don't end up with something too big or too small. And I'm just going to show you guys, we have some really great resources on the ReForest London website about selecting the right tree. You can see like the front brochure page on this slide, but I'll show you the whole page of them, and we'll send you information about this resource link in that email again. So yeah, on our website, you can see we have some information here that breaks down choosing the right tree. So it talks all about why you want to go native, et cetera, more information. And then it's a little blurry in the image, but if you go to the website, it looks fabulous. And this breaks down all sorts of trees here in London, Ontario, and kind of more about them. So the green is your best choices. You'll see the orange, yellow, and at-risk things. So you'll probably want to stick within that green area, and it's going to tell you all about trees that grow here in London. And then on our website, we have even more resources about each of these tree species, so you can really make the best choice. I'm now going to talk about the conditions in your yard and why it is so important to know all of these. All trees have different conditions which they like, and by choosing a tree that works well with your conditions, the tree is more likely to survive and thrive. The main conditions we're going to talk about and that you want to look for are and soil moisture. And I'm just going to break down each of these categories even further for you. Sunlight is kind of an obvious one, but some trees will want full sun, shade, or part sun. And so it's important to know what your conditions are before planting a tree. You can see this tree on the left here wants the full sun, it's out in the open and it's thriving. The tree on the left, this is an Eastern redbud, very beautiful. We give them away here at ReForest London when they are available. And they're shade-loving trees. So they actually want full shade, but they'll tolerate some sun. So they're great for planting under a big tree that you might already have in your yard. When you're finding out if your area is sunny or shady or what you have, you want to go out in your yard or to your area multiple times during the day. So you'll want to go in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening to see what kind of conditions it looks like all day. And also the time of year is really important. So if you're doing it in the winter, late fall or early spring, the trees around you will already have lost their leaves, and it's harder to get a gauge of what kind of light conditions you're going to have. So keep your eyes out in those seasons for any deciduous trees that are going to leaf out and provide more shade, to make sure that in the summer, the conditions are still the same as they were in the spring, fall, or winter for planting that tree. Also, an important thing to know is that your leaves can get sunburned on trees, just like a tomato plant or some other plants. So it's important to make sure you really do select the correct tree, so you don't get sunburns, and so that the ones that want a lot of sun will get it. The next one up is soil type. So there's three kind of main types of soil we're going to talk about, but as you can see on this triangle here that I'm showing, there's actually a handful of different types of soil. But we're going to talk about sand, clay, and silt. But if you look at this triangle, to break it down for you, the last word in each of these descriptors will be the soil type. So down here you have sand or loamy sand. That means you have a sand. If you have a sandy loam, it means you have a loam. And then if you have like a silty clay, it means you have a clay. So that's kind of like a good way to understand this chart a little better. And I'm going to talk about sand, clay, or loam and how to identify your soil in just a minute here. So sandy soils, if you have a pure sand, it's just like the sand at the beach. It's going to drain quickly and most of those nutrients are going to be washed away. It can be one of the more challenging soil types to manage because for a lot of trees, they're going to want a bit more organic matter than what the sand is going to give them. And you might have to add some compost to them. And also the well-drained factor means if you have a tree that likes it moister, the water is going to run out right away and it's going to be more difficult to hold that moisture. So really check on if your tree can handle sand if you have a sandy soil. So clay is very compact, just like modeling clay, and it usually drains really poorly. So you're going to get moist or more wet soils. And so you want to make sure your tree can kind of handle the clay. It's really, really packed. So some trees also have a hard time getting their roots through that clay. So there's some challenges there. So make sure that your tree can handle clay. But they do typically have a lot of nutrients, which is really nice. And that's great for the trees. You don't often have to add compost or any fertilizer if you have a clay soil. And then the third type is loam. And loam is like the perfect soil. It's what everyone wants to plant everything in. It's dark, crumbly, full of microbial life, and it supports most plants. It drains well, but holds onto enough moisture for plants and has air spaces that allow roots to breathe and spread out. It's usually easy to dig in, and it has nearly equal parts, as you can see in the center here, of sand, silt, and clay. And so loam is that ideal thing. But like I said, there's lots of trees that can handle a lot of different types of soil. So really just look up your soil type and look up your tree prior to making a decision to make sure you get it right. Now, I'm going to quickly show you how to determine your soil types. So I'll walk you through it and then I'll show you some examples. You can see in this slide, there is a mason jar way to determine your soil. It's quite easy. It takes a few days though. So you want to make sure you start this a few days before you're going to want to make a decision. Basically, you're going to get a mason jar. I'll hold mine up for you here. I brought one from my office. And you're going to add about 3/4 of the way up to water and then add as much soil so that it fills it. And then you're going to shake the jar very, very vigorously and set it aside for a couple of days somewhere that it won't get disturbed. Once that happens, you'll see, actually, this one might be a better example. And I don't know how well you're going to see it in this camera here, but you can see it in the image on the slide. You'll actually get a partition of all three of the materials, clay, silt, and sand, in the bottom of your jar. And then you just measure the side of your jar to determine your percentages. So once you get to this step, this has been in my office for months. This is a very well sat soil sample. What you'll do is, I don't have a ruler, but I brought a tape measure out, and you'll measure the side of your sample here to get the total height. So in centimeters, this is 5 centimeters in total. And then you'll measure each of those layers and divide them by the total height individually to get the percent. And so how it settles down is you get your sand first because it's heavier, then you're going to get your silt above and the clay on the very top over time as these settle onto the bottom. So this one, for instance, here, I don't know how well you can see it, but I'll try to show 5 centimeters tall, and the bottom 3 centimeters are sand. And then the top 1.5 is clay, and there's about 1/2 centimeter of silt in the center there. So I would just take all of those, divide them by that total 5 centimeters and get a percent of each. Once you do that, you can go back to this texture triangle I showed you on the previous slide. and you'll actually be able to see what kind of soil you have. So it's very, very handy. And a quick, easy way to do it at your house. So as you can see, I have these 2 jars here that I took samples of at parks when I was trying to determine what kind of soil types we had. And so, like I said, I really can't tell how well you're going to see this on the camera, but this one you can see a very clear, at least 2 layers on it. So there's sand and clay. I see a bit of silt, but if you just thought it was sand and clay, you'd be okay. Whereas this one here is a very, very clay heavy soil, and you can only see a bit of silt at the bottom of it. The striations are barely even visible because it is mostly clay, but you can see if you're really close like I am, right around here, there is a line of a finer material, and that's the silt at the bottom there. So at your house, you don't have to do this every site, but just generally somewhere in your yard, you can go on out, take a sample like that, put it in the jar, wait a couple of days, and you'll be really able to tell what kind of soil type you're working with, which makes it a lot easier to choose a tree. If you already have some trees and you're wondering how to care for them, it's still good to do one of these soil types and just see, compare it to the tree you have and see if they're working together. And if not, you might be able to remediate your soil a bit to help your tree do better. So if you're noticing, oh, my tree's not growing as much as I want, you can go out and do a soil test, see if they work together, and you might have to be watering it more because it's sandier than it likes. Or if you have a very clay heavy soil and it wants it well drained, that one's not great because it's not easy to remediate, but you can add organic matter too if you have a very sandy soil to help your tree do better. So that's soil type. And then here you can see just like some images to like a quick look at it. You see that this one on the far left, obviously dry. Far right is what we consider wet. So when you're looking into a tree and it likes wet soils, you're thinking of like riparian. It's wet, it's muddy almost all the time. And then the middle, moist. Moist is like the same thing as when I was talking about your loam. So your moist soil, it's not going to get really dry or cracked. It's not going to be muddy, but it's going to be retaining moisture. So unless you're in the middle of a dry spell, most times if you like went out and grabbed some, you'll feel some moisture to it, and that's a moist soil, just as a quick guide. Another cool thing on the ReForest London website, and I'm just going to show you a picture of it again, not very clear, but it's much more clear on the website. This is a chart that I've put together of most of the trees that we give away at ReForest London. They're all native trees. It's not fully comprehensive yet, but I'm working on expanding it as we give away more and more trees. And so on this chart, you can see I've just broken down at the top here the names of them, as well as the sun conditions they like, the soil types they like, and the moisture type they like. So once you figure out more about your yard, you can go through, look at this and be like, okay, I have a sunny yard with a loam and it's moist. And then you'd look for sun, loam, moist, and you can do a black cherry, a cranberry. You can do all sorts of things in those conditions, but this is just a really great guide to help you out on our website for when you're picking a tree. All right, moving on to how to plant a tree. I am feeling like you guys probably already have trees, so I'm gonna go over this quickly. It'll help you in the future. Maybe you've made some mistakes with your tree or you're just curious about how to do it better. So how to plant a tree. First, you wanna make a plan. Like I said, you're gonna go in your yard, you're gonna pick the site, you're gonna come up with all of your conditions and make sure that those are good. You're going to choose the right location. So you're going to look out for being too close to your tree. You want to give at least 6 feet from your house. And you want to make sure there's no overhead wires or that you're planting something that's short enough it won't grow up to those overhead wires. You're going to plant during the appropriate season. The best time to plant a tree is the fall. They're okay in the early spring too. As soon as it starts to get too warm, if they don't love it, you're going to have to water way more. And always call or click before you dig. Contact Ontario One Call. It's a free service here in Ontario that will show you any of your underground infrastructure on your property. That's really important so that you don't hit any of your infrastructure when you're digging for your tree. And most of the time, underground pipes are fine for trees. If you still have clay pipes, you are going to want to be really cautious of what trees you plant. You're not going to want to go too large, and you're going to want to avoid trees like silver maples that have a really deep, intricate root system. In Ontario One Call, we'll show you all that infrastructure, so you can make sure you leave very good room away from it as well. Buying the right species. So as I mentioned, you can get free trees from ReForest London in the spring and fall. However, if you want to buy a tree, you can go to a local nursery and make sure you get a native, local, healthy tree. So native is best, as I said before. There's lists on our website, and you want to make sure you get that native tree to support native ecosystems and our biodiversity. They're also better adapted to this climate. They already grow here, so they're used to our winter, cold winters, and they're used to our summer droughts. And you're going to have a tree that really can survive our climate, which is great. Local's great because you want to purchase from reputable staff with good knowledge about trees and support your local area. So the other big thing about buying local is that you want to kind of make sure the tree was grown in the area you're presently in. So getting a native tree to the area is great. But if the range of the tree goes like all the way up to Ottawa and you buy from somewhere where it was grown in Ottawa and planted down here, it is going to have a little bit of a different climate up there and it won't do as well. So if you can get it grown as close to home as possible, that's best. All the ones we give away are grown within like a 2-hour radius. All the seeds are collected in this area, so they're really great. And then healthy tree, you want to choose a tree with a nice straight stem. You want to make sure there's no major split, scars, or injuries on the trunk of it. And you want to make sure if it has leaves on it, it has good healthy leaves and flexible branches. Don't like go around ripping branches off trees, but give them a little bend. You want to make sure that they're well watered and that they're alive. And then how to plant your tree. So if you're doing seedlings, if you get just the itty bitty little baby seedling, you want to plant them right away. They're typically not in pots. If they are in pots, they have such little amount of soil that they dry out really quickly. You want to dig a hole that's 2 times as wide as the pot, but just as deep as the root level in the soils. And plant the tree. Your roots should not be exposed, but you also don't want to put it any deeper than where the roots are sitting on that seedling plug already. If you're planting a small potted tree, very similar steps, but bigger scale. So you're going to want to remove any sod and any grass, and then you're going to want to dig your hole 2 times as wide as the container, but the equal depth of where the soil is sitting in that container. So you want it really wide so that when you plant it, those roots can really spread out. When you get a tree that's in a pot, especially, it can start to get the roots growing around. And you really want to encourage those roots to not stay how they've been growing and to like spread into your soil. So you want to give it a lot of width. You want to dig up and loosen a lot of soil around where you're going to plant it, at least 2 times as wide as the container that it's presently in. And then you're going to want to plant it as deep as I said, the soil is in the pot. So at the very base of a tree, when you get it, even when it's young, they'll have something called a root flare. And so that's where the tree starts to widen out just a smidge at the bottom. And you want to make sure that that root flare is not in soil. You want to make sure that is above the soil. You're going to remove the tree from the pot, and then you're going to take the roots and gently tease them out from the tree once again to encourage that growth out and about. And especially if you get a tree, if you pull it out and the roots are kind of like in a circle in that pot, you're going to want to like really pull those and try to straighten them out and not leave anything in a round circle. If you plant a tree and the roots are in that circle, they'll continue to grow like that and actually like strangle itself underground. And the tree will die probably within about 15 years, but you won't know why it's dying because it's underground and you can't see that problem. So you want to make sure you tease out those roots, try to get them more straight and encourage them to grow out. Yeah, set the tree in the hole, you fill it with the original soil, and then you gently compress. It says with hands. I use my foot. I just lightly step around the tree to give it a little tuck in. You don't want too many air pockets in there. So planting a tree, bingo bongo. At ReForest London, we're working on making a video of this. So keep your eyes peeled on our social media in the next kind of month or so for a really great comprehensive video about how to plant a tree. So moving on to tree care basics. You got your tree, you planted your tree. Hopefully it's native. Hopefully you planted it well. You followed all the steps. You checked out your soil type. You added some organic matter if you had to. Now we want to take care of that tree that you planted. So I'm going to go over with you mulching, watering, protecting, pruning, and staking. So mulching your tree. Mulch is really, really important. It helps reduce moisture loss and insulates the soil from extreme summer and winter temperatures. So if you just left your soil exposed, you dug it up, there's no more sod on there, it's just bare soil, the hot sun, when it beats down on that, is going to evaporate water out super quickly. And then you're going to have a dried out tree. If you put that mulch around your tree, what you're going to get instead is that the soil, the water isn't evaporating out of the soil as quickly. So it's really helpful to retain that moisture in the water. In the soil, retain the water in the soil. Your mulch is also going to help control weed germination and growth. If you're a gardener, if you've walked past a street tree, you'll notice the mulch. It is to keep those weeds also from coming in. It's really helpful in that you don't want your tree to have to compete with any grass or anything for the nutrients that it needs to grow. And it can even improve the soil biology of the soil your tree's in. So it helps produce really good microbes in your soil if you're using the right one. Sometimes mulch can be bad for your tree. I'll talk a little bit about that here. So the types of mulch that you can use, there's inorganic ones. So if you use stone, rubber, geotextiles, etc., like sometimes people put stones around their trees. Those are okay because they help keep the seeds from coming in and help stop some of the water from evaporating out. But you have to, they don't have as many benefits. They don't decompose, they're not organic, and they actually don't do as good of a job protecting the soil. Organic mulch that you can use are most classically your wood chips. That's what I strongly recommend. That's going to be the best mulch that you can use. Some people also use pine needles and other leaf debris as well. It needs to be replenished more often because it will decompose into the soil, but it provides more benefits for your soil. So wood chips are the best. And if you can get a wood chip that is a similar tree type to the tree, if not the same to the tree you're planting, that is the absolute best, because when it rots into the soil, it's not changing your soil components to be different from what the tree wants. So an example of this, though, is that if you were planting a deciduous tree, like a nice big oak tree, but you used a pine mulch, the pine tree will rot acidic and change your soil chemistry, and your oak tree won't like acidic soil. It's a very specific example, but the best ones are cedar. It rots the most neutral. So if you can get cedar mulch, it is the best one to use. It's just a little pricier. To mulch your tree, you want to surround the tree with a thick ring of mulch, but you want to avoid what we call a mulch volcano. So you want to make sure it's really flat around the tree. If it piles up too high, a few things happen. One thing is that it's like a volcano and it's touching the tree, it will start to rot over time. And if it's touching the tree, it'll actually cause your tree to rot as well, and damaging and at times killing your tree. So you really want to make sure that your mulch is not touching the tree and it's not high up. The other thing is that if you have this volcano, the water is going to hit the volcano and actually run away from the tree, and it's not going to water your tree. And then if you have it too high, but it's not touching your tree, you create a little basin for water to just collect in there. And that's really bad for the tree too. So you want to be all the way around the tree, and you want to be relatively flat. You want to go at least 10 centimeters out from the tree to keep the moisture in and discourage weed growth close to your tree. And you'll probably have to remulch about every year for the first few years of the tree. You can keep mulching as long as you'd like, really. But at least for the first few years is really the important years to get that mulch down. And like I said, you want it to not be touching the tree. So I always do a 3-finger rule, or about 5 centimeters of mulch-free ground around the tree, just to prevent it from hurting your tree. Watering. So as I was saying before, getting a native tree is really helpful because it's used to the droughts and it's going to survive the best in the situations that it's in. But when trees are young, and especially newly planted, they're much more susceptible to dry conditions from the shock of the transplanting them. So you want to water a young tree. As your tree gets older, you shouldn't have to water anymore. If you choose the right tree, it's going to do great in the right site. But water them when they're young. So I usually say about the first year to 3 years. Water, I only water when it gets very dry because I've chosen trees that are good for my yard. But the best way to water is slowly and deeply. So if you ever heard of a trickle water, it is hands down the best way to water your tree. What you do is you put your hose, not your house, your hose, on very low, and you leave it at the base of your tree for 30 to 60 minutes. And by very low, I mean like trickle, like it's basically just dripping. And when you leave it on there for 60 minutes, it gives time for the soil to really get the water all the way through it. It doesn't just shock the tree or move through really quickly. If your hose doesn't reach, you don't have a hose, you don't want to leave it on for that long. The other thing you can do is put a few small holes in the bottom of a big bucket, fill it with water and put it beside your tree. And same thing, it'll drain out much slower to help that water from not just going right through the soil and making sure your tree gets it. In London, I believe there is a watering like bylaw, and it depends on if your house number ends in an even or odd number, you can only water on even or odd number days. That's how it used to be. It may have changed recently, but I believe that is still true. So try to do even days or odd days, depending on the last number of your house. Protecting your tree. So you want to keep trimmers and lawnmowers at least a meter from the base of the tree. This is also why the mulch is helpful. It gives you a good barrier so that you don't have tall grass growing around your tree because you don't want to mow right up to it. Don't allow children on the branches until the tree is well established. Watch out for your dogs. I hear about people's dogs ripping out new trees all the time because it just looks like a yummy stick. So keep your eyes on your dogs out there. Don't trim your tree without researching tree trimming methods and learning about them. And never cut the leader off the top of the tree. So the leader is, if you have a tree, the very top, like straight branch at the top is your leader. If you cut that off, you're going to lead to your tree making 2 new leaders. And over time, that's going to be weakening to the tree and it's not as good. You want one straight main stem on your tree. If you're doing a shrub that has multiple different branches on it, like a choke cherry or an elderberry, for instance, you'll have a few leaders and you can cut one of them off if you don't want that one to keep growing. But if you have a maple tree, an oak tree, a basswood, something with one strong leader, you never want to cut the top of it off. It will hurt your tree. You also want to watch for girdling. So girdling is like if you have a weed whacker, you get too close and it like cuts into the bark of your tree and damages it when it's young. You don't want to do that. So be careful about that. I'm going to talk about tree collars a little later on, and we'll learn about ways that you can protect your tree with those. But tree collars are one of the best ways to protect from weed whackers and lawnmowers. Pruning. I'm going to do a very, very light talk about pruning here. And I say this because there are risks with pruning your tree. I'm not a tree pruning professional, and it can be difficult. So I always say you should trim very sparingly. And so I'm going to talk about the best branches you should trim. And aside from that, if you really want to learn more about pruning, and especially if you have fruit trees, I mentioned earlier on in this webinar that there is a fruit and nuts tree webinar with Jessica from Wildcraft Permaculture, and she goes a lot more in depth about pruning. She has videos and examples of it. It's way, way better and more comprehensive than what I'm going to talk about. So if you're curious about learning more about pruning, that's why you're here. I'm going to give you a really brief overlook, but you should really consider signing up for our fruit and nut tree webinar to learn more about pruning and the best ways to do it. Even if you don't have a fruit tree, it can be really helpful to learn about pruning. And there are also a lot of good resources online, and then there are some on our website as well if you're interested in checking out reforestlondon.ca for a bit more information about pruning. But general rules: never prune more than 25% of your tree at a time. So as important it is to cut off some branches, you still need the branches and the leaves for your tree to grow. So it's very important that you never take off more than 25%. The branches that you're going to prune should be either dead, dying, or damaged branches. And so you can see in my image here, I don't know if you can see my cursor. This image is pretty great though. It shows some examples of why and where you would prune. So there's a broken branch that's not doing anything for the tree anymore, cut it off. If you have a branch that's very clearly dead on your tree, cut it off, especially because it might be housing a disease or a fungus that killed it. You want to get it right off the tree. And then this one shows an example of a V-shaped crotch. If you have this lower down, as the tree starts to widen, that kind of like crotch in the tree will get tighter and tighter. So if you have like a really tight V branch, you can prune that off because it'll help prevent like your tree from rubbing into itself. Down at the bottom, you see suckers here. So suckers can come in kind of anywhere along the low base of this tree. And it's basically trying to make like a new leader for the tree. Sometimes they just get excited. Sometimes the weather scares them and they're like, ooh, I'm going to sucker on out. Cut off suckers. If you see your tree making new shoots at the bottom, get rid of those. You don't want them. And then up here, it shows like a crossed over branch. So two branches that are overlapping a lot. You can prune those as well, just to help the trees not rub into each other and promote better leaf growth on the ones that are doing well. And then down here on this one branch, it shows these water sprouts or water shoots. They're similar to the suckers at the bottom, but they'll pop up on some of the lower hanging branches and they'll be like growing straight up and look like the new top of the tree. Prune those off as well. If you're ever unsure and you're like, this doesn't really look dead, do I want to cut it off or not? My personal advice, don't cut it off if you're unsure. Learn a lot more before you start heavily pruning trees. I basically only cut off what's dead. So that's my rule of thumb. And another big thing is you want to avoid flush cuts when you're pruning. So flush cuts are when you prune right against like the trunk of the tree, and you don't want to do that. I think a lot of people think, oh, I have to get it as close to the tree as possible. You actually want to give like about an inch before you cut off a branch, maybe even a little less, like a half inch, just to make sure that the tree heals itself properly. If you get too close to the bark, it can be damaging. It doesn't have the same ability to like cover up that wound, and it can lead to your tree being very unhappy and possibly dying. So you actually want to prune a little off the trunk. You should always prune in the dormant season. So early spring and winter, like the end of fall, you can get away with it too. You should never ever prune during the growing season, which is late spring and during the summer. It's not good for your tree. They get confused if you cut them while they're trying to grow. You should prune before they grow. And that also helps promote better new growth if you prune during the dormant season. They'll kind of like come back to life when it warms up and be like, oh, that thing didn't work. I'll try somewhere else. And like I said before, never ever cut off the leader of your tree. If you have a tree with one main stem and it has a top, never cut that top off. It will lead to your tree trying to make two new tops, and it leads to your tree getting weak over time. You want to leave that leader on. It's very important. That's pruning. Like I said, there's some good videos online. There's some resources, and we have a webinar with more information about pruning. Do so cautiously, but do cut off dead. Always remove dead branches and branches that are dying or damaged. So if you see one that's a little bit broken or the leaves on it are getting sick or it's not doing well, cut those ones off. That's about it. It's all for a good tree. That's all you really need to do. If there's like large cuts that need to be done, if you have like a quarter of the tree that's dying or a lot of branches like hanging over your house that you want off, you should call an arborist. You should contact an arborist, and you should get an arborist to do large amounts of work, large tree branches and branches up high. It's very dangerous to be cutting off large branches and also can damage the tree. So you really want to get an arborist with some specialties to come out and help you with those. So I have a tree that's really close to my house, for instance, didn't plant it, and the branches do overhang my house a lot. I have a skylight, and I get an arborist to prune that for me because I don't want any branches falling and breaking my skylight. But I also am not going to get on the ladder and try to cut off large branches. It's very unsafe. So do so at your own risk, do so cautiously. Basically only prune dead branches when they're really young. Once they get big, they're usually good to go. If you have any things you're worried about, call an arborist. We're going to talk a little bit about staking. Sometimes when you get a potted tree, especially if it's already really long in the pot, it needs to be staked because it was in a greenhouse. There's no wind. You plant it out in the open. There's wind. Gets a little bit of a lean on. You don't want a little bit of lean. You want really straight trees. If you plant your tree properly, it will really strongly prevent that lean. If you don't plant it properly, or like I said, it's just really windy where you're living for whatever reason, you're going to have to stake. Or you come into someone else planted it and it's not really doing well. Stake it. The best way to stake, this image is great. It shows the best way. That is 2 stakes on each side. You can use wooden stakes, those like metal kind of farm rebar guys. Those are 2 great options. And you want to do a figure 8 around each tree with a stretchy material. You can use twine, but the best thing is actually to use like stretchy tree tape. It's literally called stretchy tree tape. And you can buy it at most garden centers, hardware stores, etc. And you're going to tie that figure 8. The figure 8 allows room for the tree to move a little, breathe a little while still holding it up. You're going to tie the stakes parallel to the wind. So the same, if your wind's blowing this way, you'll have stakes on this side and this side. If the wind's blowing this way, you'll have stakes on this side and this side. That's very important. Also, you should only stake your tree while it's young, within the first 2 years of planting it. After that, you shouldn't stake your tree. And it is really hard to straighten out a tree past that point. If you have a very bendy tree, you still can stake it. You can still encourage it to grow straighter, but if you get it while it's young, that's the best way to go about it. And you really only should do that. You also want to make sure you don't girdle your own tree by staking. So the stretchy tape's good in the figure 8 because it's not tied right around the tree. You never want to like tie a knot right around the stem of your tree because the tree grows wider and it will grow into whatever you tied around it like that, and it'll girdle it and leads to damage and oftentimes death if you girdle your own tree. So don't do that one. Next up, is my tree dying? This is the most common question I get asked by people coming to pick up from trees, people calling and inquiring with me. They're like, oh, my leaves turned this color. Oh, this happened. Oh, is my tree dying? I'm going to go over a few kind of key indicators if you do have a dying tree. But once again, my best advice is that if you have a tree you're worried is dying, you're unsure, contact an arborist and have them come out and take a look at that tree for you. And if you have any of these things I'm about to talk about, more than one of these things I'm about to talk about, you might have a dying tree on your hands and you should call an arborist. I'm just going to give a quick kind of overview about some of the things to look for because sometimes the tree is stressed and sometimes it's dying. So if greater than 1/3 of your tree doesn't have leaves, then it's dying. If it's less than 1/3, if a few branches aren't getting leaves, it's probably just stressed. If you have loss of bark or large cracks in the trunks, you can see this big image here of this tree. It has no more bark on it. All that bark's fallen off. If you start to lose large swatches of bark, your tree is probably dying. If there's large cracks in it, not good. If you just like saw, something got to a bit of the bark, a little bit of bark falling off, if you have a birch tree, you're going to lose a bit of bark. But if you're seeing like chunks of it come off, it's dying. If you only have, like I said, few healthy leaves left, so greater than 1/3 doesn't have leaves. Also, healthy leaves, you want your leaves to come up in the spring. You want them to be green, the correct color. If your tree leaves are not looking very healthy, and all of them aren't looking very healthy, might be dying. But once again, when you plant trees when they're young, sometimes the stress of replanting them makes them like lose their leaves or get a bit of yellowing, especially new trees or trees in pots. They tend to lose their leaves way earlier in the fall, and it can be like really overwhelming. You're like, it's September 15th. Why did my tree just drop all its leaves? One cold night, it's a young tree. It might be like, ooh, winter, gets naked. So that's probably not a cause for worry. But if it's like, June, July, and you're not seeing very many leaves growing on the branches, greater than 1/3 of your tree doesn't have leaves, then you're looking at a problem. If you have no new growth. So every year your tree should put on, even when they're really old and big, they still put on some new growth. So your new growth, you'll see buds. If you look at the tree, they form at the end of the summer and they open in the next year's spring. So end of the summer, fall, you'll start to see those buds along all of your branches form, and then you'll start to see those buds open. If your tree is not doing that, it's not a really great sign, like at all. Most of the time though, your tree is going to do that. And then on young trees, most of the new growth actually won't have it'll kind of come in green. So if you have like a new tree, say it's like yay tall, you're getting some new growth on it, that top new growth will be a lighter color green. It doesn't start to establish its bark right away, especially in the spring. You should see young trees putting on that lighter green new growth on the edges of the limbs, along the stem, and on the top of the stem. Look out for those. If that is not happening at all in the spring, if you're in the early summer, you're not seeing any green new growth, check on your tree. Get an arborist if you don't know why it's happening. If it's from any of the things I mentioned before, you might be able to still save it. Another one that happens a lot, if you really have a dying tree, if it's rotting on the inside, you might start to see a lot of mushrooms at the base of your tree. If you're seeing large patches of mushrooms at the base of your tree, that's cause for worry. You might want to start looking at the leaves, looking at the branches, looking for scratches and loss of bark. And if you're seeing those things, you're going to want to call an arborist. They will give you the official diagnosis. All you can do as a tree owner for the most part is decide, is my tree healthy or not? And we'll talk about some common pests and diseases later on. And you might be able to see if your tree has one of those. The biggest and best way though, that I'm going to teach you to tell if your tree is dying, and I don't mean to scare you with this, It's just good to see if your tree's dying. But the best way to tell is called the scratch test. So my next slide here. All you do is you take, if the tree's young enough, just your fingernail or a sharp knife, and you very gently scratch just that first little bit of bark off on either the trunk of your tree or on a new branch, and it should be green. On the right-hand side, you can see it is green underneath. That is the cambium, or the protective layer of your tree. It is green, it is alive, it is full of sugars and nutrients. If you scratch your tree, like you see on the left, and it is not green, it is brown or beige, it does not have living cambium there. You can do it with just a branch on your tree branches to see if the branches are alive, and you can do it with the trunk to see if it's alive. As it gets older, it gets a little riskier. You only want to take a little bit off, and sometimes the lower bits of bark on tree can be quite thick. But when they're really young, it's super easy to just do that little scratch with a knife or your fingernail and look for green. If you're not seeing that, then it's cause for worry. If you're seeing green, great, your tree is alive. It's probably just stressed, and that's why you might not be seeing some of those leaves. So that's my best trick for trees. I just want to talk a little bit about chlorosis. If you have a chlorotic tree, or as you see on the left, this really yellow tree, it is dying. It won't necessarily have to die, but you do have to treat chlorosis, and you have to try to do it as early as possible. So if you have a maple tree and the trees are quite yellow and you didn't intentionally buy one that has like a yellow tree, then you have chlorosis. It happens to red maples specifically really badly, a handful of different oak species, tulips, and white pines, some other trees. The treatment is, you should get an arborist to check on your chlorotic tree, and they'll be able to help you better determine. But some steps you can take before you contact an arborist if you're starting to see some chlorosis is try adding some nutrients, so some organic compound to your compost to your tree. If you're not watering it all, maybe start watering a bit. If you are watering it, maybe lay off the watering a bit. It's not completely known what leads to chlorosis at this moment. Like, there's a handful of different factors. And so an arborist can come by and help you treat your tree and get it back to life. And that's really the best way. Otherwise, you're just sitting there guessing. An arborist will be able to look at your soil and look at the conditions and better decide how to treat your tree for you. But it's usually a problem with the roots. Another great thing about chlorosis is that if you use mulch, it produces better root systems, which are least likely to get chlorosis. So use your mulch, people. Yeah, red oaks are specifically really bad for this. I've been seeing a lot of red oaks around the city this year that have really bad chlorosis. And I'm like, should I knock on this person's door and tell them their tree's dying? No, you guys can. I never knock on doors. I'm just kidding. But all right, so next up, we're going to talk about pests and diseases. Actually, just want to backtrack for a second. The one thing I forgot to talk about earlier on in this is fertilizing your tree. If you choose the absolute right tree for your scenario, you shouldn't need fertilizer really. You get into more fertilizer or nutrient needs if you're in the wrong soil types. There's about a tree for each type of condition that you can get to work perfectly. But if you do need to add nutrients to your tree, it's not suggested to use the chemical fertilizers because they deplete through the soil really quickly. They're made of chemicals and they only give your tree like a little boost and then they're gone. So I compare the chemical fertilizers to like an espresso shot. Like, yeah, it's going to wake you up for a little bit. And then by the evening, you're going to be tired again, compared to like changing your diet and like eating really well and like eating your greens and having smoothies. That's what organic compost is going to do. So if you can get organic fertilizers, like you can get the bags of shrimp compost, you can make your own compost, sheep manure compost, like bags, you can just get these at the hardware store, but you want to look for organic components in your composting because those actually infiltrate into the soil and become a part of your soil and help your tree in the long run. And they last years instead of like a month of fertilizer. So you should always use organic ones. And organic composts are going to help prevent chlorosis and can be used in times to treat chlorosis, not chemical ones. All right, pests and diseases. I'm just going to talk about some common pests and diseases that we have here in Ontario. I'm going to give a brief outline of them. Some of them are more dangerous than others. And if you have some of these, I'll kind of let you know. You will want to contact an arborist once again to check on your tree. I can teach you how to look for them, what they mean, but a lot of them are not treatable on your own. So we'll get right into it. We're going to talk about, you can see on the screen, all of these things I will teach you about just now. And we're going to go through these quick. If you have questions about the end, you can ask me. The first is a Japanese beetle. These are an invasive beetle from, you guessed it, Japan. They are metallic green heads with these colorful wings on them with a green underhue, and they do what's called skeletonizing the leaves. So as you can see, they don't eat the veins at all. They just eat all the like leafy bits around the veins. So you'll have these like skeleton leaves on your tree if you have them. And they also affect like a lot of garden varieties. They eat all kinds of things. They're pretty easy to see. Some ways that you can treat them. The most organic way and the most tedious way is soapy water, and not just like putting soapy water on the plant. You actually have to go out with like a thing of soapy water and go look for them on the leaves and like scrape them into the water and leave them there for a couple hours. It'll drown them and kill them, or like a full day even. So you actually have to go around, they like the undersides of leaves. So you like go around and specifically early in the morning, if you can, and look on the undersides of leaves and like scrape them into soapy water. You can also use these pheromone traps, but they're not recommended because they actually kind of will attract them to your yard and then trap them, but it doesn't always work. And sometimes it just ends up with people with Japanese beetles in their yard because they had a trap that attracted them there. And it can bring in other beetles. So they haven't found a pheromone that just attracts the Japanese beetle. It attracts all kinds of beetles. So some people use them. They're not my best recommendation. If you do use them, you should place them away from the plants you're trying to protect, like actually kind of far. So if you have a tree with them, you're going to want to put them like far away from the tree so they don't find that good old leafy greens. And you want to empty the pheromone traps very quickly. And then another way that's been known to prevent them pretty well is if you get a spray bottle and you mix soap, water, garlic powder, and cayenne pepper in this spray bottle and spray it on your leaves of your plant. It doesn't really hurt your plant and it won't kill the beetles, but they'll take a bite and be like, oh my God, it's spicy, because garlic and cayenne pepper are very, very spicy and soap is gross. And it also, that one's pretty good because it'll help deter any squirrels and rabbits as well. Also, there's some new research that shows that geraniums have a toxic effect on the beetles. So if you plant geraniums around your yard, it will help. There's a few wild, like native geranium species. So wild geranium, Herb Robert geranium, and Bicknell's cranesbill geranium are kind of the three native ones. You can get into a lot of garden varieties and they're not actually as good for our pollinators. So if you stick with those three species, it's good. Japanese beetles can be quite destructive. So like you can see on this, they completely skeletonized the leaf. If you have a lot of them, they can eat through a lot of foliage and really, really deter growth on your tree. So you want to keep your eyes out for them. The best method I've found is just scooping them. It's time consuming, but it's kind of nice. You go out with your coffee. Feels good to get rid of them. I like it. The next one is the LDD moth, and this is also known as the gypsy moth, the European gypsy moth. But gypsy is not a nice word. It's a bit of a slur. And so society, North America as a whole, is trying to move towards LDD. I still find myself, I call them gypsy moths all the time, but I'm really trying hard to correct to this LDD terminology. If you hear them called as gypsy moth, though, this is what I mean by it. This is what everyone means by it. You might have noticed them the last few years. They have been very bad in Ontario, falling off trees, covering sidewalks. If you went to the Pinery last year, all of the trails were covered. Bowler Mountain's rope course had a bunch of them. People's trees had a bunch of them. The good news is that they're on like, I can't remember if it's 11 or 13 years, but like 11 or 13 year cycle. And so they've been really bad for a few years and they're going to kind of start to naturally taper off, go dormant for a bit. And then in 11 to 13 years from now, they'll get really bad again. They're not a native species. They were accidentally brought here in like the late 1800s or early 1800s from Europe. And they completely devastate our trees. So they eat all of the foliage on a tree. it's not like the Japanese beetles where they skeletize it. They actually just eat like the whole leaf. So they're not great. And the good news though, is that a good healthy tree can survive up to 7 times of being defoliaged from an LDD moth. But you don't want to let it get there at all. I have 3 pictures of the 3 different life cycles. Here it is as a moth. You can see over here, this is what its egg sacs look like. And then this is what it looks like as a caterpillar. There's a handful of ways that you can prevent and help remove LDD moths and save your trees. The first one is that in the late fall, winter, and early spring, you can actually go out and look for these egg sacs and remove them from the tree. You just scrape them off just like with your hand or a butter knife, wear gloves, and just like scrape them off and stomp on them. That's the best way, is removing those. But sometimes they're really high up in the tree. Sometimes you can't get to them. And so then the other way to prevent them in their caterpillar phase is to burlap your tree. So you actually want to get like a chunk of burlap and tie it around the bark of your tree, the lower bit of your trunk. And that way, when they're trying to crawl up or down your tree, like mostly up, they can't pass that burlap sac. And so they can't get up to the leaves to eat them. So that's been a really effective method that's been used all over Southwestern Ontario this year, is burlapping trees. And then also, if you see a moth, remove it. Like I hit them off the tree and stomp on those bad boys. Same with the caterpillars. But another good news is that there's like a natural disease kind of fungus. I can't remember if it's a disease or a fungus that these caterpillars get. And it kills them. And so if you see one of these caterpillars on a tree, but it's like only half on and it's like dangling off the tree, leave it, because that means it has that disease and it'll spread it to the other caterpillars on the tree. So if you see one alive and crawling, take it off, kill it, hit it, bye. If you see one like half off dead, leave it. It will kill its friends. There is also an insecticide spray that you can do for them in the cities. London spray, like a lot of places are spraying. It's not recommended for personal private places. It's not a very nice insecticide. It is useful, it's helpful, it saves a lot of trees. But for your own personal property, the scraping of the egg sacs and burlapping and killing caterpillars is the best way to get rid of them. Oh, and the distinguishing features, like I said, so those are the egg sacs. They're kind of fuzzy on the bark of trees and a white, off-white color. The larvae are like this little, they come out really small and brown at first. And then the caterpillar itself, as you can see up here, its distinguishing features are these 8 blue dots at the head, and then the rest of it is red dots. So if you see near the top of it, those series, sometimes it's only 6, but it's typically 8 blue dots to 10 blue dots. That's an LDD moth, LDD caterpillar, kill it. Emerald ash borer, these only affect, as you read it, ash trees. They're a metallic green looking wood borer. There's a picture of them on a penny to show just how small they are. They will kill an infected tree within 1 to 3 years. They're only harmful as the larval stage. So these are the ones, I'll show you the next picture here, that bore under, and they make this beautiful bug art that kills your ash trees. We no longer give away ash trees. The city stopped planting them, and a lot of places have stopped growing ash trees in an attempt to stop the spread of these. They're still quite prevalent all over Southwestern Ontario. They've done quite a number to ash trees. But sometimes you'll see the ash trees coming in because for the first kind of few years of their life, the larva won't affect them. It's not until they're older. So sometimes they still come in young, you know, a few seeds fall from a big old one. Once they get to a certain age, the borer will kill it. Here's some things to look for. The holes, the exit holes on your, first of all, make sure you have an ash tree. There are D-shaped exit holes, very obviously D in the bark. You will start to lose foliage. Your tree will start to die. The bottom of your tree might start to make a bunch of like shoots and suckers on it in an attempt to save itself because the top of it's dying. So if you have an ash tree and you start seeing all these like suckers at the bottom, it's a very bad sign. And then also under the bark, if you remove the bark, you will see this lovely bug art. Those are the ways in which you can tell if you have ash borers. There's like a new bioinsecticide that they're trying called Treason to stop these emerald ash borers. It's not working amazingly. It's helping save some, but most of our ash trees are dying. So if you have an ash tree, keep your eyes on it, keep your eyes out for borers. Deers, rabbits, and other critters. These ones are a big one. They will really hurt your tree. As you can see in the image here, you can get deer. They rub their antlers against your tree and rub off all the bark and cut it open. Not very nice. The second one, this is what mice and rabbits will do to your tree. They'll just eat away, nom, 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 at the bottom of your tree. They like the sugar under the barks in the winter. And then this is a deer just eating those yummy, yummy new buds off in the spring or in the fall. Deer love new buds on tree. They eat them. Ways in which you can prevent them. Tree collars, I mentioned them earlier on. You always want to put a tree collar on your tree for like the first 5 years until it's basically filling that collar, and then you can remove it and your tree is typically strong enough. There's 2 different collars that I'm showing in here. There's these wraparound ones and then a straight up and down tube. I have some examples I brought from my office to show you guys what they look like. You can buy them at garden centers, hardware stores, and if you get a tree from us, we always give you one. So there's these guys, you just wrap them around. And then there's these nice tall kind of clear ones, and the same thing, they open up and you wrap them around your tree. And they prevent mice and everything from eating at your tree or rubbing against your tree. You want to make sure that they're like flush with the very, very bottom of the ground so the mice can't get in under it. If you're still having a really big problem with deer or other critters eating your tree, you can buy this stuff called Scoot. It is a repellent for deer, mice, everything. And there's some instructions on the bottle on how to apply it. You can get it like Rona, Home Hardware, all over. Scoot with a K. It's basically a latex paint with a bittering agent. It doesn't kill or hurt the animals. It just makes your tree taste really, really gross to them. So they're going to try to eat it and be like, ugh, I don't want that. And it saves your tree. If you have a big problem with deer, that's great. But typically your tree collars here are going to be really great. Also dogs, I said earlier, sometimes dogs can really hurt your tree. So if you get like little fences, you know, like chicken wire, or even a few kind of sticks and stakes just around your tree when it's really young to make sure your dog's not running into it or pulling it out of the ground. Oak wilt, it's not in Ontario, but it's all over the US in the Carolinian region. So we're really feeling like it's only a matter of time before we start to see it here. You can keep your eyes out for it. It turns your tree leaves brown, reddish, yellow, and it basically stops the flow of water and nutrients through your tree. It will kill your tree. All varieties of oak are susceptible. Most trees are unable to recover. It will kill your tree. Also, the fungus goes into the ground and it will kill other trees around it. We don't know how to deal with it yet, aside from removing the diseased trees before they have a chance to spread. Like I said, it's not in Ontario yet, but we're feeling like it's going to come to Ontario because it's in the same tree species we have here, just a little bit further south down in Georgia, in Kentucky. And so we're keeping our eyes out for it. If you have an oak tree, keep your eyes out. Tar spots, these ones are very, very common on maple trees, but guess what? They're fine. I get people asking about these all the time. They are a fungus on your tree called rhytisma. It won't kill your tree though. It leads to these like raised black spots on the surface. The best way to kind of prevent it, because it doesn't look great, is when your trees fall off, if they have the tar spots, you want to rake them up and like destroy them. So either burn them, put them in the yard bags and get rid of them. You don't want to use this leaf litter anywhere else or leave this leaf litter on your ground because the fungus will spread. But like I said, unless your tree is like absolutely covered in these tar spots, a few of them are fine. Your tree can totally handle it. They're not hurting it that much at all. Galls, similarly to the tar spot, not all that harmful unless you have apple trees and you get like apple galls. Those are a little different. But typically you'll get like some of these kind of orangey or green galls on trees. Sometimes they're on the leaves, twigs, roots, or flowers, but most commonly on the leaves. They're caused by insects that lay their eggs or feed on the plant. And if there's like something in their saliva or just like an egg sac, it leads to this little gall. More often than not, these are fine. They're not going to kill your tree. A tree that's really susceptible to these are hackberries. If you have a hackberry, you know all of your leaves are covered in these galls. I thought it was a part of the tree for a really long time because I grew up with a hackberry in my yard. It doesn't hurt the tree. It's not killing the tree. It's just some insects doing their thing. They coexist together and your tree's fine. Like I said, unless you have like an apple or a pear tree and you have some galls on that, on the leaves of those, that can be a different disease. You should look into it. You could do a quick Google search about apple gall or have an arborist come look if you think that that is the case. Lastly, a thing that is very bad for your tree is road salt. There are a few trees that are extremely intolerant to road salt. It will kill them. Those are red maples, sugar maples, and white pines, among a few others. Basically, the road salt that we use here in Ontario increases the salinity of the soil, and it decreases photosynthesis rates. So it stops your tree from being able to make as much nutrients and transport those nutrients, and also changes the composition of the soil. So if you planted your tree in like the perfect spot soil wise, and then you have a lot of salt suddenly building up, it's going to change that soil and lead to it not being in the perfect place anymore. And it's also just not a problem in winter because, as you know, salt dissolves if you put it in water. If you put it in soil, same thing, it dissolves and stays in that soil forever. So if you want to plant near your driveway or somewhere that's going to get a lot of salt, you want to plant trees that have a high tolerance, such as junipers, aspens, and red oaks, or even like a moderate tolerance, get a little bit further from the driveway. You can do basswood cranberry, birch, or silver maple. If you're planting near your driveway or near the road at all, absolutely, I highly recommend never planting a red pine tree. If you have a red pine tree near your road, watch out for salt on it. It hates it, it will die. But typically you can get away with a handful of different trees on the front yards and you'll be fine. And then lastly, well, before I get to this, I just want to mention that the best defense against any and all of the things that I mentioned today is a good, healthy tree. If you select the right tree and it's in the right place, it's already going to be really strong. If you add some organic matter to your soil, it's going to do really well. If you're mulching, if you're watering when it needs water when it's young, it can defend itself against almost all of these. Like I said, if you have a healthy tree, the LDD moths can't kill it. There's a few ones like that are a bit different. So the emerald ash borer, unfortunately, is going to kill your ash tree. But even the Japanese beetle, if you have a really healthy tree, they're not going to be able to really kill it. It's going to come back. It's going to be fine. Associate it like having a cold as a human being. If you get the common cold and you're all around really healthy, you're going to get a little sick. You're going to be a-okay though in a couple weeks. If you're already really unhealthy, if you have immunodeficient disease, or you haven't been eating really well, or what have you, and then you get a cold or you're old, you're going to get much more sick. It's the same with trees. The healthier your tree is in general, the best defense it is against these things. Keep your trees healthy, plant the right trees, keep your eyes on them. If you're noticing some really big problems, call an arborist, make sure that your soil is doing okay. And that's the best defense. The right tree in the right place is the best defense, aside from emerald ash borers and the oak wilt, which we don't have yet, but when we get it, it's going to kill your trees. Lastly, I'm going to talk a very small smidge about the tree bylaw. So here in London, we have a tree bylaw. We have a tree bylaw. There's a couple ways in which it might affect you as a tree owner learning about tree care. Wrong way. So London's tree bylaw, it prohibits a tree within the tree protection area or a tree of distinction from being injured or damaged by a person without a permit. If you think someone's violating this, you can call or email London's tree protection office. And so there are some big distinguished trees around the city that are protected. And then there's also specific tree protection areas. If you live really close to like a ravine or an ESA, you might be near a tree protection area. And that means that the trees in there are not allowed to be damaged at all or cut down. So keep your eyes out. If you go to the London city map on the London website, they have a London city map and it'll show you the areas that are tree protection areas if you're curious. If you have like a protected tree, so a tree of distinction on your front lawn, if you're worried you have one, you would know. They're typically like memory trees or whatever, they have plaques. So that's one thing. So you might have a tree of distinction. Sometimes really old ones in old neighborhoods are, but like I said, you would more than likely know if you have one. But if you live near a tree protection area, if you're in a tree protection area, one of our ESAs, trails, where you know it's a tree protection area and somebody is cutting down trees, you should tattle on them because it's terrible. London has a few, especially around the edges of the city. The outskirts, we have some tree protection areas for some distinguished wetlands and areas where the trees are quite important. The other one, and this is the one. Oh yeah, okay, so there's two parts to this. So boulevard trees. If you live in a house and you have a tree on the boulevard, so on the other side of the sidewalk, that is not your tree. That is a city tree, just so you know. So also if you have any problems with it, you don't have to call an arborist. You have to call the city's urban forestry department and tell them about these problems with the tree, and they send an arborist. So anything that's on the other side of the sidewalk from your house is a boulevard tree. It is owned by the City of London, and it is protected from any injury or damage. You can request to have a tree plant on your boulevard, and also I think you might still be able to request species through urban forestry, but the biggest thing is that they also have to care for it. They have to cut branches when they become dangerous. They have to assess if there's any damages. If your tree looks like it's getting sick in front of your house, they have to send the arborist and deal with it. You can request these services from urban forestry at the City of London. And so this tree protection office, I think, is the same as urban forestry, but if you just Google London urban forestry, you'll get to their office. So if you have a boulevard tree, you need it trimmed, it's over your house, it's over your driveway, it has some dead branches, it's looking sick, call the city. It's their responsibility, not yours. But it also means that you are not allowed to cut it down at all, ever. Basically belongs to the city. Another part to this, and I'm unsure the complete logistics of it still. I wanted to get to know a bit more about it today because I learned that it had changed from my knowledge. But trees over a certain size are protected by the city bylaw, and if you remove them, you have to get special permission and plant, I think, 4 more trees in place of removing this tree if they're over a certain size. If you go to if you search London tree bylaw, you'll come up with some answers, and there's some difficult language to read, to be honest, that will teach you more about that. But if you're cutting down a tree on your property and you have an arborist come out to do it, they'll always know. They'll be like, oh, this one's too big, you need permission. But just something to keep into mind if you have a very large tree on your property, that it might be protected.